A good Woch. Welcome to week number 3. Can you believe that? We're starting our third week, which means we are halfway through. And tonight's letter is a letter that took a little bit of extra research in order to properly understand, because the Rebbe is writing to an Israeli politician, a fairly prominent Israeli politician, but one that I had to do a little bit of research to understand more properly what the context of the letter was. And I will try to fill it in as we go. And remember the letter to Louis Finkelstein, where the Rebbe said, Rebbe Machabed Ashirim, why did Rabbeinu HaKadosh honor rich people? And the Rebbe was explaining because Rabbeinu HaKadosh had to guide the Jewish people during a time of crisis. And when you're guiding the Jewish people during a time of crisis, you need to be a good talent scout. And you need to identify members of the people who have influence, and you have to network with them. Remember that letter? I don't remember how long ago. Maybe it was probably over a week ago. So this is a good example of that. The Rebbe is sort of developing a relationship with this politician, not necessarily because this is someone who's already an ally, or at least not a strong ally, completely aligned with the Rebbe's worldview, which is similar to the letter to Finkelstein, for that matter. But rather, as was the case of the Finkelstein letter and many letters from the Rebbe to many people, the Rebbe is writing to people who maybe you would think would be unlikely allies, but the Rebbe perceives an opportunity to create a relationship and to find common ground and to expand that common ground. And that itself, before we get into the particulars of this letter, I think that itself is an incredible teaching and an instruction for all of us, that there's no sense preaching to the choir, as we say. Maybe even you can also preach to the choir. I'll redact that. But in addition to preaching to the choir, you don't have to only talk to people who already agree with you. Internet bubble, anyone? Yeah? Search engine echo chamber, anyone? In 2023, people, is it 2000? Yeah, it is 2023. People are indignant that other people could have different opinions than them. And they get really upset about that. That's it. He posted such and such on his Facebook, which is against my politics. He's an idiot, and I have nothing to do with him anymore, right? Okay. Well, let's learn from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Find common ground with people and expand on that common ground, okay? It's a common theme in the Rebbe's life, in the Rebbe's correspondences, in the Rebbe's teachings, in the Rebbe's example. Let's read the letter tonight, okay. Baruch Hashem Yud Gimel Adar Beis, Tavshin Yud Tes, Brooklyn, New York. Do you know what the 13th of the second Adar is? It is Tainus Esther. At least in a regular year, it is. Unless Purim comes out on Motzei Shabbos. In that case, the day before Purim is Shabbos, so you don't fast on Shabbos. But in most years, Yud Gimel Adar Beis is Tainus Esther. It's the fast of Esther. So this is when the Rebbe wrote this letter, the fast of Esther. L'chveid Mar Eliezer Livneh. To the Honorable Mr. Eliezer Livneh. Who is Eliezer Livneh? Eliezer Livneh, or Liebenstein, was born in Poland, in Lodz, Poland, and was an early immigrant during the pre-state Zionistic immigration to the Holy Land. And he was actually part of the Haganah, and he was aligned with that kind of political group. he became affiliated with the Mapai party, that's Ben-Gurion's party, the very leftist, originally extremely dominant, perhaps even we could say they had a monopoly on political power in the state. So he was from that background. He was from that. Those were his friends. Those were his peers. In addition to being a politician, he was, and I should mention that he was an MK. He was a member of Knesset in the very first Knesset, meaning right after the Declaration of Independence in 1948. And at the time of that I was writing to him here in 1959, he doesn't hold an official seat, but he's still very active as a politician. And he was also a writer. In fact, even before 48, he was known for being a newspaper editor. And apparently he was a good speaker as well, and just an influential person. And like I said, he came from that background. Maybe I should fill in just a little bit more. So Ben-Gurion was the first Rosh HaMemshala, the first prime minister of Israel. And he came from a very specific type of demographic, which I would say dominated Israeli politics for sure for the first 20 years of the state. And that was, I'll just say it bluntly, Eastern European, Ashkenazic, secular, leftist, almost, I don't even know if I should say almost, but anti-religious thinkers, intellectuals. That was the ilk that dominated politics in the early state. The truth is, it wasn't really until Begin won the election 30 years after the founding of the state that that absolute dominance, almost monopoly on power that Ben-Gurion's party, Mapai, had over state politics. So I want to explain to you that Livneh was part of that group, but he was sort of kind of like a fringe within that group. So what I'm saying to you is he wasn't the type of person that you would automatically say, oh, he's going to be sympathetic to the agenda that the Rebbe wants to pursue. He wasn't religious at all. He came from that same background, that same party, those same leanings as Ben-Gurion. But the Rebbe saw in him a slight, let's say, opening of the door, and the Rebbe seized it. Now, I should also tell you that when the Rebbe wrote to him on Tainas Esther, Tavshin Yud Tes, that was the second time the Rebbe wrote to him. The first time was a year previously. Livneh had sent the Rebbe some articles that he wrote. I mentioned to you that he was a very gifted author. So he had sent the Rebbe some articles, and the Rebbe responded regarding the articles. So now this second letter is not in response, at least not in a direct response to a letter from Livneh. You know, most of these letters will begin b'mayna, b'mechtave. This is like the standard way that most of these letters will begin. The Rebbe is saying, like, I'm answering your letter, and the Rebbe will say the date when he received the letter. So here it doesn't start that way because the Rebbe is not directly responding to a correspondence. The Rebbe is, he's going to say why he's all of a sudden reaching out. The Rebbe is going to say right now why he's reaching out. Shalom Avracha, greetings and blessings. Nizdamin lo yadi. So the Rebbe says, it reached my hand and it came to me. And according to Chassidus, I'm laughing because the Rebbe always grabs an opportunity to teach Chassidus. This guy wasn't religious. I don't know if he was interested in learning Chassidus or not, but the Rebbe puts it right in there, right in the beginning. And according to Chassidus, nothing is accidental. Everything is divine providence. So the Rebbe puts that in like that little Maimer Musker, that little parenthetical phrase. So the Rebbe is basically explaining the words nizdamin. Nizdamin means it happened, but nothing just happens. So the Rebbe is like, I happened to receive, but nothing just happens on accident. Everything, of course, is divinely orchestrated. What did I receive? Keta mimichtov iti, an excerpt from a newspaper article. Hamasaper shekvedei oimid la'argein anoshim shehem tmimei deya itai. It says that you're going to organize, or you are organizing, a group of people who are like-minded, who have a similar outlook as you do. Al dvar shinuyim hamuchrochim, regarding essential changes beshetach hakalkola v'chulu, in the field of finances or economics. Livneh was involved. Like I said, he wasn't actively holding a seat at that point, but he was still very involved in politics, and he was still officially very much aligned with Mapai. But from within the party, he was attempting to make some changes from within that would somewhat shake things up and shift some of the policies away from what they had been. They had been a very hardline leftist, socialist approach, and at least in economic matters, Livneh wanted to shift away from that. So here's where the Rebbe sees sort of like the opportunity for something more. Okay. The Rebbe mentions also that in that newspaper article, or the excerpt of the newspaper article that the Rebbe read, it mentions another detail, Vasher be'irgun zeh, that in this group, it was, by the way, it had a name. It was called the Mishtara Chadash. And it wasn't like a party, but it was, sounds to me more like a movement within a party. So within that group, nichnosim kama anshe das orthodoxim. There are many religious Orthodox members. Okay? So Livneh is making a shift away from the more established party line, and he's starting a movement or a group to address some changes in economics. The economic policy at that time was very, very socialist. And that did not change until Begin was elected to office, which is 20 years, almost 20 years after this letter. Okay, so the Rebbe is saying, I heard that, or I saw that in a newspaper article. I see that there's some frum guys who are also part of this. Okay, so let's see. Vihine bechlal. Now the Rebbe says, in general, in life, kishemaschilim l'shanes l'chadish b'shetach echad shel tachnis chayim v'ashbos elam. When you start to make a change in one area of public policy and influence, Harei oz nokil yeser, it's much easier than laha'adam for the person laha'isef chidush to add another new thing. U'lashanis gam b'shtochem achedim shel hashkafase, to make other changes in his outlook. Okay, you see where the Rebbe is going? The Rebbe is saying you're starting something new. You're making a little bit of a shake-up in the establishment, that they should deviate from where the party line had been before. So the Rebbe says, hey, it's possible that while you're shaking up one area of people's worldview, you can shake up other areas of their worldview as well. And in other words, if we're into change right now, if we're into things that are new right now, so maybe this is an opening to add some more new stuff. Yachadim Zen, now compounding this together with this. So first of all, there's an opportunity because things are changing anyway. And an additional aspect here. Hine kemei b'chol tefoes hatava shesheirei bohem hachoik dashbos gemlim davke. I don't know. Forgive my ignorance of modern Hebrew. Maybe a real erudite Israeli speaker can tell me if hashbos gemlim davke, or davke is the Rebbe's word, but if you can tell me if hachoik dashbos gemlin, maybe I could have Googled that. Probably should have, but tell me if that's an idiom, if that is an expression, or if the Rebbe is creating that term. Basically, it means the law of reciprocity. It means that things flow in a dynamic back and forth. So, and the Rebbe says this law, he calls it a law, predominates in the world. It's sort of just one of the many rules that the Creator embedded in the universe. That's just how it works, that when there's influence going, it sort of gets bounced back. That's how I'm describing this. Okay. So, since that's the situation, since that's the law, that's the way the world works. So for sure it's applicable also in this situation. Kavanosi, what am I talking about? Lahashbos gemlim shel hachavedim orthodoxim al shar havedim v'al tachnisa shel ha'irgun bichlal. I'm talking about the opportunity for some of these religious members of your group to have an influence on the organization and its policies and on the organization in general and on the other people in the organization. And specifically what I mean is that they should have an influence regarding our religion, our Torah and its mitzvahs. In other words, these guys joined the group, okay, so you sort of brought them in and gave them a platform. But what's going to happen is, it's just inevitable, this is the way things work, is just like you gave them this position, they're going to give back, and they have now an opportunity to influence the other members and the organization in general. And what I'm saying is, maybe this new organization can have a little bit more of a religious tone to it, or even just a religiously sympathetic tone, or maybe even you could say, as opposed to Mapai's history, it could at least just be a little less hostile against religion. That's what the Rebbe seems to be saying here, that you're shaking things up anyway. You have a few religious guys in this new group as well. It would be an opportunity to sort of adjust things and to get people to maybe be a little bit more aligned with traditional Torah values. That's what the Rebbe is saying. So you see, the Rebbe is seizing an opportunity here. Should I be like Paul Harvey and tell you the rest of the story? I mean, we're still in the middle of the letter. I'll just finish this paragraph and then I'll tell you the rest of the story. The Rebbe says, I love this. There's always room for improvement in this area. You know why I love it? There's probably other reasons to love it that I'm not thinking of. I love it because it's not like the Rebbe is saying, oh, you're not religious. You need to improve. You need to become more religious. No, the Rebbe is saying, there's always room for improvement in this area. If you were the chief rabbi, I would encourage you to strengthen in your personal observance and your influence on other people's personal observance. I mean, there's always room for improvement when it comes to being more aligned with Torah. So I like that for that reason. Okay, so anyways, the rest of the story is... this Livneh was not religious, and to my knowledge, he never became religious. But, and his party never became religious, and the organization itself was not religious. But there was a softening, at least on his part, personally. And he had not only a sympathetic view of Yiddishkeit, but later on, when things became even more difficult to do so, meaning when there was even greater pressure, he stood up and he took the side of Yiddishkeit. In Tafshin Lamed, so we're talking about 11 years after this letter, the Rebbe made some comments about Mihu Yehudi, about the law of return, and about who is a Jew, and defining Jewish identity. And it was taken as a controversial statement. And we're going to speak a little bit more about Mihu Yehudi here in this letter. But Mihu Yehudi, I'll explain a little bit more, was not such a hot button issue in 1959 as it became in the coming years. I will talk about that a little bit because the Rebbe mentions it at the end of the letter. But when the Mihu Yehudi issue was becoming extremely contentious, there was a big pushback against statements that Rebbe had made. And in fact, there was an article in Haaretz, and it said that because of the Rebbe's position on Mihu Yehudi, that we should prevent the Rebbe's Mivtza Tefillin, the Tefillin campaign, which of course we know that Rebbe started on the eve of the Six-Day War in 1967, the initiative of going around and offering every Jewish man and boy above bar mitzvah the opportunity to put on tefillin as often as possible on every weekday, all days, including excluding Shabbos and Yom Tov. So apparently the pushback was that since the Rebbe said something that the establishment didn't like, so now we should thwart his tefillin campaign as well. So Livneh got up, and again, I mentioned he was a gifted writer, so this is very important. He used his pen, and he wrote an article defending the Rebbe and defending Mivtza Tefillin. And the Rebbe responded to it directly, wrote him another letter, and told him, it was very interesting, the Rebbe said, first of all, you should know personally, and it's rare that the Rebbe would give glimpses into his personal life, but he says, I grew up as the son of the rabbi of Yekaterinoslav in Russia, in Ukraine. And during the really heavy days of the Stalinist oppression, so it was not so easy to be Jewish then. And he said, my father was a target of the government. So he says, I know what pressure is all about, right? So he says, I wasn't really so bothered by the attacks and the pressure, but why does tefillin have to be the victim here? Tefillin, why is tefillin guilty? Why does there have to be less tefillin? They want to come after me. Okay, come after me, but why are you punishing tefillin? So he thanked Livneh for standing up for tefillin and making sure that the mitzvah would continue. Okay, so that's the rest of the story. That's where this relationship goes. But let's continue the letter. Uchvedei k'ma'argin hakvutza. So you, as the organizer of this group. By the way, I think that he left that group a year later. So it wasn't necessarily that it wasn't the specific issue that the Rebbe was writing to him about didn't necessarily materialize in an obvious way, but it planted seeds, which one of those seeds sprouted in a way that we know about, which I just told you about a minute earlier. And who knows how many other ways that it sprouted. And we're talking about a very influential person who was in the halls of power and spoke to all of the top people. So whatever influence that Rebbe had on him, I'm sure had an effect that there would be absolutely no way of us to actually measure in any quantifiable way. So you, as the organizer of this group, according to the newspaper article, you're the guy, you're like the main initiator, you're the advocate, you're the guy who came up with it. Hare afshe shagam bezeh olav liyes hayoizem umachriz. Maybe you can be like the initiator and you can get up and you can announce. Meaning the Rebbe is saying it's not like you're just invited to the party. It's your party. You know, you can do whatever you want over there. You started the whole thing, so you could be the guy who gets up and announces. Shemuchrachas hashiva el hamakodos. It is essential that we return to the sources. And I love this poetry here. Hanishanim chadoshim nitzchim. To return to the sources which are old, new, eternal. Sort of a beautiful expression there. The old, new, eternal. It's a paradox. It's both timeless and timely. You can meme that if you want. Send me your likes. All right. Remember, he was starting a whole new thing. That was his thing. His whole thing was called the New Party or the New Organization. That's what he actually called it. So the Rebbe is saying, okay, new is good, but the new, old, eternal. So meaning, it's funny. You can truly be progressive, do something new, and shake things up and introduce innovation. How? By returning to our tradition, okay, which is both ancient, obviously has that advantage, but it's also absolutely relevant in today's day and age. I should tell you also, the next letter that Rebbe writes to Livneh, there's a great line in there where the Rebbe says about Torah has to be practical. Torah has to be actionable. And the Rebbe actually says there, Hamaisa hu ha'ikar, which is something that the Rebbe said publicly thousands of times. Hamaisa hu ha'ikar, the main thing is action. So the Rebbe points out that, you know, in Yiddishkeit we have philosophy, the deepest philosophy, and we also have halacha, which is a guide for day-to-day practice. So the Rebbe says, look at the Aseret HaDibros, look at the Ten Commandments themselves. It starts with Anoichi. It starts with the proclamation of monotheism, which is the deepest of the deep, philosophy, theology. But it ends with things like don't kill, don't steal, don't covet, like really day-to-day stuff, really pedestrian issues that people deal with. Oh, the Rebbe actually uses an English word there. It doesn't write it in English. He writes it. It's one of those modern Hebrew words, which is actually an English word. The Rebbe uses the word instinctim, instincts. So the Ten Commandments starts with talking about the loftiest spiritual proclamation, I'm the Lord your God. And in the end, it talks about how human beings have to deal with reining in their instincts, with their most basic animalistic instincts. Found that to be fascinating. Okay. Toidos Moshe Misinim Mitzvah. And what is the old, new, eternal source? It is the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu got from Sinai and all of its mitzvahs. Uba'ifin maisi dafke. And in a practical way, specifically, meaning in action, not just the ideas. Ki ha'maisu hu ha'ikar. Yeah, the Rebbe says it here as well. The Maisa is the main thing. Only action is the true indicator of any ideology in any person. You want to see what an ideology really is? Don't tell me what it means on paper. Show me what it does. You want to tell me who a person is? Don't tell me what the person teaches, what they say. Show me how they live. That's the only Even HaBeichen. That's our only indication of what something really is. Ubesignen Hamagila Shekoiden Isa Ba'ed Shois Sfurais. And in the language of the Megillah, which we're going to read in a few hours. Remember, I told you that Rebbe is writing on Tainus Esther. It's literally a few hours before the night Megillah reading. So the Rebbe says, in the words of that Megillah that we're about to read, who knows if it was for a moment just like this that you ascended to the government, in this case, in the Megillah, Malchus means the kingship. Speaking to Esther, that's why it's in the feminine. So why did you become queen? Why were you installed into the palace? Perhaps just for this reason, Esther, so that you could save your people. And the Rebbe takes those words that were said to Esther and he says them to Eliezer Livneh and says, maybe the whole reason why you are a powerful guy and that you're on the inside and that you're connected in Israeli politics is just for this moment, so that you can stand up and tell this new group, guys, you know what? We're making some changes anyways in economic policy. I think it's time to soften our approach about being against religion. To the contrary, maybe we need to draw some inspiration and some guidance from our tradition. So that's what the Rebbe is telling him. With steam and blessing, and you should report good news and everything we said, and you should have a Purim Beseder. I like that. Usually we say, a happy Purim. Here is like, Beseder. What does it mean, Purim Beseder? Zayser Meres, that means Kedvara Megillah Asher Yishletu HaYehudim Goymer. Like the Megillah says, that the Jews won. The Jews won. Meaning, this should be a victory. Everything you're doing should be a victory for real Yiddishkeit. Now, before I read this last part, which almost reads like a PS, because the Rebbe already wished him a happy Purim, or a Purim Beseder, I just want to give you a little bit of context. I mentioned Miyu Yehudi earlier. At this point, Miyu Yehudi was not the huge hot button issue that it would become later. And I'll explain to you why it wasn't yet, but how it was starting to cook up. And that's why the Rebbe is referencing it here in this letter. Ben Gurion had a son who was hospitalized in a British military hospital. He was injured while fighting. And he met an English nurse, and they married. And this became obviously an issue, not just for Ben Gurion as a private individual, but then as a representative of the Jewish people. So, long story short, at the end of 1958, Ben Gurion started writing letters to Jewish leaders of all types and of all backgrounds all over the world, asking how to define who is a Jew, regarding the law of return, regarding who is given citizenship in the new state of Israel. And Ben Gurion wrote 51 thinkers of all levels of religious observance and all different types of political persuasions. He received 46 responses to his 51 letters. And of the 46 responses, 38 of them, including the response of the Rebbe, told him unequivocally that Judaism should be defined the way halacha has defined it for centuries and millennia, not to introduce any innovation into the definition of a Jew. So that's why I say it was a little bit less controversial of an issue in 1958 and 1959, because the overwhelming response, even from non-religious people, was to allow the religious halachic definition of Jewish identity to stand, meaning only one who is born from a Jewish mother or has a halachic conversion. And that's why the issue sort of rested, so to speak, relatively speaking, after that point. It became much more controversial again later, okay? But here was the beginning of that contention. The Rebbe's response actually was a month earlier, a month prior to this letter. The Rebbe's response to Ben Gurion is from Ches Adar Rishon, Tafshin Yud Tes. So it's a month and 5 days, because this is Adar base. So the Ben Gurion letter was Adar Rishon. That's the background. Okay, so let's read this. Assyrios perushim shainim umushunim. Shainim umushunim. Shainim umushunim is kind of an idiomatic phrase. There are many, and some also very unusual. Among them, some unusual pirushim, commentaries, Lemegillas Esther, to the biblical book of Esther. Okay? There are many, many, many commentaries to the biblical book of Esther. Aval bezeh kula mishtavim. But they all say the same thing regarding this. Regarding what? Asher af shahaman amar lahashmid v'lareg. Although Haman said to annihilate the Jews. Mordechai v'nahafichu. And Mordechai wanted to do the exact opposite, save the Jews. B'deya achas hayu. But Haman and Mordechai agreed on one thing. V'gam Achashverosh v'chol hadera hu imohim, as well as Achashverosh and the entire generation. Everyone agreed. U'laloi tzel shel safek, without any shade of doubt. Mi hu Yehudi. Who is a Jew? So the who is a Jew issue was starting to become an issue. As I mentioned, Ben Gurion had just sent out those 51 letters. The Rebbe had just responded a month prior to this letter to Livneh. And I should also tell you that, remember the Rebbe said we're going to Kriyas Megillah in a few hours? So the next day, the day of Purim, there was a Farbrengen. Farbrengen is, officially it's the day of Purim, but it's coming out of, it's the night coming out of the day of Purim. Okay, so we're talking about the next day, that night. There was the Rebbe's Purim Farbrengen. You remember a few letters ago, we talked about the Rebbe's famous Purim Farbrengen of Tafshin Chai, of Tafshin Yud Ches. Farbrengen that went, 9 hours? Is that what it was? Yeah. So this is the next year, Tafshin Yud Tes. I don't think it went 9 hours. It did not go 9 hours. In that Farbrengen, the Rebbe says a sicha. It's actually the fourth sicha of the Purim Farbrengen, Tafshin Yud Tes. You could look it up in Teres Menachem. And many of you will recognize that fourth sicha of Purim Tafshin Yud Tes as a sicha from Likutei Sichas Chelik Gimel, which in Likutei Sichas, the edited sichas of the Rebbe in Chelik Gimel, was put under a section of Shabbos Parshas Zacher. The actual sicha was originally said on Purim, at this Purim Farbrengen, but in Likutei Sichas, it's a section unto itself called Parshas Zacher. Parshas Zacher is the special Torah reading we read the Shabbos before Purim. And it's about the obligation to destroy Amalek. And the Haftarah of that Shabbos tells the story of Shaul HaMelech, the first Jewish king, and how he had an opportunity in his day to destroy Amalek, completely to eradicate them. And Shmuel HaNavi, Prophet Samuel, found out that Shaul came up with a clever idea. He said, you know what? I'm going to leave the king, Agag, to survive, and I'll take him as my prisoner. And so during the hours that Agag was a POW before Shmuel executed him, which he did, he conceived a son who became the progenitor of Haman. So the whole business with Haman was because Shaul didn't follow the rules. And as the Haftarah and its commentaries explain, Shaul wasn't trying to be rebellious. No, not at all. And he wasn't even being lethargic in carrying out, lax in carrying out his orders. He actually had a reason Shol holach acharatam. He followed reason. He followed reason, and he had a great argument why what he was doing made a lot of sense. And the Rebbe even adds their explanations. While al pichsidis, it could even be argued what he was doing was a really cool thing. But you know what? That wasn't what he was told to do. He was given very explicit orders, and he didn't follow them. And so many of you may be familiar with that sikha. Like I said, it's Likutei Sichos Chelik Gimel, Shabbos Parshas Zocher. And it's basically about the idea of don't try to outsmart Hashem. That even when we have really smart ideas, we're not smarter than infinite wisdom. And we need to have Kabbalah's oil, and that means to submit to the divine authority. I want to mention also, because it's just something that I am passionate about, in that same sikha, which happens to be one of my favorite sikhas actually, he explains that thinking is also a part of Kabbalah's oil. He says, because if you think that you're going to just turn off your brain and that way you'll have Kabbalah's oil, he says that's cheating. You're not allowed to do that, because Kabbalah's oil, submission to the divine authority, means to give Hashem all of you, not just your action, but your brain as well. And to give Hashem your brain means that you have to be a thinking being. You have to continue thinking, but you have to think in the ways that are aligned with Hashem's will. So, yeah, it would be easier to just become a robot and never think again. And then, I have Kabbalah's oil. The Rebbe says, that's not Kabbalah's oil. Kabbalah's oil is not only when you do Hashem's will, but you teach your brain. You train your brain. That's why we're learning Igros, guys. That's why we're learning the Rebbe's worldview. When you train your brain to think in alignment with the Holy Torah, that's true Kabbalah's oil. Kabbalah's oil has to be not just on a level of action, but also emotion and intellect. Okay, so that's that famous sikha. At the end of that sikha, and this is not included in the edited portion that's in Likutei Sichos. Likutei Sichos is highly edited. The Rebbe spent a lot of time editing and re-editing the transcripts of his Farbrengens to make it acceptable to him in the format that Likutei Sichos was meant to be. Likutei Sichos is a very different format than just a transcript of a talk. They each have certain milas. There's a certain geschmack that you can really only get when you read the original Hanocha, where you see the interwoven conversations and how the Rebbe is flowing from one subject to another subject, and even commenting on current events or commenting on things that are happening right there in the building at that moment. And obviously you don't get that in Likutei Sichos. Likutei Sichos is more of the lumdus. It's more of the scholarship. But here's what I want to tell you. If you go look up, I told you the fourth sikha from Purim Tafshin Yud Tes, you'll see that famous sikha from Chelik Gimel of Likutei Sichos there, and it's very recognizable. It's very close. The edited version is very close to the transcript. But then at the end, there's something that's not in Likutei Sichos, and that is that Rebbe says, since it's Purim, I want to say a Purim Torah. Purim Torah means a clever, witty teaching that is more about it's more about the humor than necessarily scholarship. But if it's a true Purim Torah, it also has to be, the point of it has to be true. Yeah, obviously it has to be something that aligns with Torah and and aligns with truth. So the Rebbe says, I want to say a Purim Torah. And the Rebbe says, there was a machlekes in the time of Purim. And this is almost what the Rebbe writes here to Livneh 24 hours earlier. But the way that Rebbe said it at the Farbrengen is just slightly different, and definitely a lot funnier. The Rebbe sets it up as a Purim Torah, and it is very cute. And there's recordings of it, by the way. Maybe we'll post it on the WhatsApp groups. If people are, you should mention. I've mentioned before, but I'm going to mention again. 30letters30days.com. So you go there, and I believe you can sign up for the WhatsApp groups. And you receive a lot of additional stuff that we don't have during the class. Like we just posted the other night, an original image of the letter that we learned. We were privy to an inside source that gave us a picture of the actual letter. And we post stuff like that. So you should definitely join the WhatsApp. And you know what? I'll post the audio from Purim Tafshin Yud Tes, Bli Neder. So the Rebbe says like this. In the time of Purim, there was a machlekes. It was Haman versus Mordechai. Haman said, lahashmid v'lahareg, that we got to annihilate the Jews. And Mordechai said, no, Yehudim, like we just said earlier tonight at Havdalah, this is maybe our Motzei Shabbos tie-in, that no, the Jews should have light and joy and gladness and glory. So they were at an impasse because they wanted very different things for the Jews. However, one thing that they did not debate was Mihu Yehudi. They had very different plans for the destiny of the Jewish people. Opposite plans. But they did not debate who the Jewish people were and what the definition of a Jew was. Okay, so that's tonight's letter, and we will see you, Mi'atzeh Hashem, tomorrow night.